Japan's history is often reduced to samurai, cutting-edge technology, and ancient tradition. But beneath these symbols lies a far more complex story. This is the story of how a small, resource-poor island nation rose to become the world's second-largest economy. How did a country that spent 250 years in near-total isolation modernize faster than almost anyone else? And why did that success eventually slow down? How did a society built on discipline and order come to face loneliness, isolation, and one of the fastest aging populations on Earth? From Japan's prehistoric origins to bullet trains, from economic miracle to silent crisis, this video explores the complete history of Japan. Let's begin. Japan didn't begin with samurai swords or imperial palaces. It began in silence, shaped by forests, mountains, and a restless land at the edge of Asia. These islands were close enough to the continent to feel its influence, yet distant enough to grow in their own direction. Nature was never a background detail. Earthquakes fractured the land, volcanoes reshaped it, and seasonal typhoons regularly destroyed early settlements and harvests. The land itself taught an early lesson. Stability was an illusion. Japan's earliest inhabitants lived during the Jomon period, beginning around 14,000 BCE. They were hunter-gatherers, yet they also created some of the oldest pottery ever discovered anywhere in the world. These intricate vessels reveal a society that cared about ritual and meaning, not just survival. Long before states or armies, Japan already possessed a distinct cultural rhythm. Around 1000 BCE, that rhythm began to change with the arrival of new populations from the Asian continent, marking the beginning of the Yayoi period. These newcomers brought wet rice agriculture, metal tools, and new ways of organizing society. Rice farming tied communities permanently to the land, demanded coordinated labor, and produced surplus. Hierarchy followed. Land, food, and power became inseparable, and Japan began its transition from scattered communities to an ordered agrarian world. As villages expanded, some were fortified, surrounded by ditches or defensive structures. Burial mounds grew larger and more elaborate, signaling rising inequality and concentrated authority. Competition between clans became unavoidable. Leaders emerged who could protect territory, control resources, and command armed followers. Conflict became a political tool, not an exception. These early struggles established a society where power flowed toward those who could enforce order. Spiritual life was rooted in the natural world, where mountains, rivers, forests, and even storms were believed to be inhabited by kami, living spirits woven into daily life, and political power soon attached itself to these beliefs. By the early centuries CE, ruling clans promoted the idea that the imperial line descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. This myth elevated the emperor beyond ordinary politics and placed him at the sacred center of the land. Even as real power shifted between clans and military leaders, this symbolic authority endured. Few civilizations created a political symbol so enduring and so adaptable. Japan was never completely cut off from the world. Writing, Buddhism, metalworking, and systems of government arrived from China and Korea, but they were never adopted blindly. Foreign ideas were filtered, reshaped, and made distinctly Japanese. This habit of selective adaptation became a defining trait. By the end of this early era, respect for nature, a sacred political center, emerging social hierarchies, and a careful balance between change and continuity were firmly in place. The age of samurai had not yet arrived, but the world that would produce them was already quietly taking shape. By the late 12th century, Japan's old imperial system was collapsing. The emperor still ruled in name, but real authority had slipped away. Taxes went unpaid, provincial power grew unchecked, and violence became the language of politics. Japan was no longer governed from the court in Kyoto. It was governed by force. From this instability emerged a new warrior class, the samurai. They were not romantic heroes, but professionals trained for violence. Their role was simple and brutal: protect land, enforce authority, and destroy rivals. Loyalty was not abstract or sentimental. A samurai served a lord in exchange for land, status, and survival. This relationship became the foundation of feudal Japan. Over time, this violent profession surrounded itself with philosophy. Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized loyalty, discipline, and readiness for death. In theory, A samurai lived honorably and died without fear. In practice, survival came first. Samurai switched allegiances, betrayed masters, and carried out massacres when ordered. Honor existed, but it often followed power rather than principle. The first military government, the Kamakura shogunate, emerged at the end of the 12th century, marking the shift of real power away from the imperial court. When it weakened, authority fractured again under the Muromachi period. By the 15th century, this breakdown exploded into the Sengoku era, an age of warring states, where rival clans fought relentlessly for land and dominance. Castles spread across the countryside, armies marched, burned, and rebuilt. Authority was local, temporary, and constantly contested. This was not an age of elegance or restraint, but one of exhaustion and survival. Yet out of this chaos, a new political solution slowly took shape. That solution was the shogunate system refined to its extreme. The emperor remained sacred and untouchable, but real power belonged to the shogun, Japan's supreme military ruler. Beneath him, regional lords known as daimyo controlled their domains through networks of samurai. It was a structure designed not to eliminate violence, but to contain it through hierarchy, loyalty, and constant oversight. By the late 16th century, a small number of warlords came close to unifying the country through ruthless strategy and overwhelming force. Figures like Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi demonstrated a hard truth. Peace in Japan would only be achieved through absolute control. Then, in 1543, foreign ships appeared on Japan's shores. Portuguese traders brought firearms, global trade, and Christianity. Guns transformed warfare almost immediately. Within decades, Japan was producing tens of thousands of muskets domestically, and massed infantry fire replaced traditional sword combat on the battlefield. At the same time, Christian missionaries converted large numbers of people, including influential daimyo. For a brief moment, Japan stood on the edge of deep entanglement with the outside world. The ruling elite reacted decisively. Foreign religion challenged loyalty. Firearms disrupted the social order. Trade brought wealth, but also instability. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, which took power in the early 17th century, Japan chose closure. Christianity was banned, foreigners were expelled, Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the country. By the 1630s, Japan had effectively sealed itself off from the world. What followed was one of the most unusual periods in global history. For over 250 years, Japan experienced internal peace. There were no major civil wars and no foreign invasions. Samurai no longer fought battles. They became administrators, officials, and enforcers of order. Society hardened into rigid classes where birth determined destiny. Innovation slowed, but stability prevailed. This closed world was controlled, predictable, and remarkably durable. It was also fragile. The system worked only as long as nothing challenged it. And beyond Japan's shores, the world was changing faster than ever. In the middle of the 19th century, Japan's closed world shattered almost overnight. In 1853, American warships appeared off its coast, armed with modern cannons and a simple demand: open your ports or be forced open. Japan had no modern navy, no industrial army, and no realistic way to resist. The sense of safety created by centuries of isolation collapsed in a single moment. The shock went deeper than politics. Japan watched what had happened to China and much of Asia and understood the warning immediately. Nations that failed to modernize were carved up, humiliated, and ruled by foreign powers. Japan now faced a brutal choice: transform itself completely or disappear. The response was radical and deliberate. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration dismantled the old feudal system from the top down. The samurai class was stripped of its privileges. Hereditary stipends were abolished. A nationwide conscription system replaced warrior elites with a modern mass army. Swords were banned from public life. Centuries of tradition were swept aside with ruthless speed. Power was centralized under the emperor, not as a medieval ruler, but as the symbolic center of a modern nation-state. Modernization followed at an astonishing pace. A national education system was built almost from nothing. Railways, factories, and shipyards spread across the country. A modern army and navy were created using Western weapons, Western training, and Western doctrine. The guiding belief was simple: Adopt Western technology, but preserve a Japanese spirit. This transformation demanded sacrifice. Discipline became absolute. Individual desires were pushed aside. Loyalty to the state was elevated above all else. Industrialization and militarization advanced together, reinforcing one another. Japan was no longer focused on survival alone. It was preparing to compete with the world's great powers. And compete it did. In 1895, Japan defeated China in a war over influence in Korea, exposing the weakness of the Qing Empire. Just 10 years later, in 1905, Japan defeated Russia over control of Manchuria and the Pacific. The shock was global. For the first time in modern history, a non-Western nation had defeated a major European power in a full-scale war. Japan had proven it could stand among the great powers. And that realization changed everything. The emperor was elevated from a distant symbol into the sacred core of national identity. Loyalty to the emperor became loyalty to the nation itself. Nationalism intensified, and military leaders gained increasing influence over politics. Expansion was no longer described as ambition or aggression, but as destiny and historical mission. That belief quickly turned into action. After becoming a Japanese protectorate in 1905, Korea was formally annexed in 1910. In 1931, following the Mukden incident, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria and established the puppet state of Manchukuo the following year. War expanded across China and later into Southeast Asia. With few natural resources of its own, conquest was framed as necessity. The military dominated decision-making. Dissent was suppressed, and compromise was treated as weakness. Once Japan began moving forward, turning back was no longer considered an option. When World War II erupted in the Pacific in 1941, Japan entered the conflict convinced of its own inevitability. The attack on Pearl Harbor and rapid victories across Southeast Asia seemed to confirm that belief. In just months, Japanese forces seized Hong Kong, the Philippines, Indonesia, and vast resource-rich territories. But Japan was now fighting industrial giants, especially the United States, whose factories, shipyards, and manpower far exceeded its own. Japan lacked oil, struggled to replace lost ships and aircraft, and suffered mounting losses of experienced pilots it could not train fast enough. By 1942, the tide began to turn. Defeats in battles such as Midway shattered Japan's naval power. As the war dragged on, American bombing campaigns reduced entire cities to ashes, supply lines collapsed, and Japan's ability to continue the war steadily disappeared. By 1945, defeat was no longer a possibility. It was unavoidable. The end came suddenly and catastrophically in August 1945. Atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki within days of each other, killing an estimated 100,000 to 210,000 people by the end of the year from the blasts, heat, and radiation effects. Faced with total destruction, Emperor Hirohito intervened and announced Japan's surrender. For the first time in its history, the country was occupied by a foreign power. The empire collapsed, the military was dismantled, and millions were dead. Japan emerged from the war physically ruined and psychologically broken. In less than 70 years, it had raced from a feudal society to a modern military empire, and lost everything it had built. Now, it faced a different challenge, rebuilding without conquest, without militarism, and without the beliefs that had driven it forward so relentlessly, and ultimately, so disastrously. But the American forces arrived not to annex the country, but to remake it. Between 1945 and 1952, Japan was rebuilt under U.S. supervision. In 1947, a new constitution came into force. The military was stripped of political power, and war was formally renounced. The emperor remained, but his status changed fundamentally. He was no longer divine. He became a symbol, human and fallible, severing the spiritual link between nationalism and warfare. These reforms cleared the ground for economic reconstruction. Land reforms broke up large estates and redistributed property to millions of farmers. Education was overhauled, with strong emphasis on literacy, science, and engineering. Japan was no longer preparing for conquest. It was preparing to produce. A crucial turning point came with the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. As U.S. forces fought nearby, Japan became a supply hub for food, uniforms, vehicles, and machinery. Factories restarted, jobs returned, capital flowed in. What began as emergency procurement became the foundation of recovery. After the occupation ended in 1952, Japan entered a period of extraordinary growth. From the mid-1950s through the early 1970s, the economy expanded at an average rate of around 10% per year, several times faster than the United States and Western Europe during the same period. The state quietly guided this growth. Banks were encouraged to lend to priority industries. Investment flowed heavily into steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, and electronics. Work replaced war as the organizing force of society. Long hours, discipline, and loyalty, once demanded by the military, were now demanded by corporations. A standard work week often exceeded 50 to 60 hours, and many employees expected to stay with the same company until retirement. In return for loyalty, firms offered lifetime employment, company housing, steady wages, and social identity. This system delivered rapid growth, at the cost of personal freedom and exhaustion. Large corporate networks, known as keiretsu, tied banks, manufacturers, and suppliers together. These groups favored cooperation over competition and long-term planning over short-term profit. Innovation was often incremental rather than revolutionary, but efficiency, reliability, and quality became Japan's global signature. Exports powered the miracle. By the 1960s, Japanese cars, cameras, and electronics were flooding international markets. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics showcased a modern, disciplined, rebuilt nation to the world. Bullet trains, expressways, and dense cities became symbols of progress. Living standards rose rapidly. A broad middle class emerged. For the first time, millions believed their children would live better than they had. By the 1980s, Japan was the world's second largest economy. Its companies dominated global manufacturing. Books praised the Japanese model, and Western executives studied it, feared it, and tried to imitate it. Japan had not only recovered, it had reshaped global competition, but success quietly changed the rules. Easy credit replaced careful planning. Money flowed less into factories and more into assets. Rising land and stock prices created the illusion of endless growth, even as productivity gains slowed beneath the surface. By 1989, stock prices in Tokyo were among the highest in the world, and land in central Tokyo was valued more than entire cities overseas. Companies borrowed aggressively. Banks lent without restraint. Growth was no longer questioned. It was assumed. The miracle had reached its peak, and the foundations were already cracking. Between 1990 and 1992, the bubble burst. Stock markets collapsed. Property values fell sharply. Trillions of dollars in paper wealth disappeared almost overnight. What followed was not a single dramatic collapse, but a long slowdown. Throughout the 1990s, banks were crippled by bad loans. Companies stopped expanding, and investment dried up. This period became known as the lost decade, though in reality, stagnation would last far longer. Economic growth remained weak well into the 2000s, and real wages barely moved for an entire generation. The old social contract began to unravel. Lifetime employment, once a cornerstone of Japanese stability, became harder to maintain. Companies increasingly relied on temporary and contract workers. By the early 2000s, a growing share of young Japanese found themselves in insecure jobs with lower pay and fewer benefits. The expectations of loyalty and sacrifice remained, but the rewards no longer followed. At the same time, Japan's demographics began to shift dramatically. Birth rates had been falling since the 1970s, but by the 1990s, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Fewer children were born each year, while life expectancy continued to rise. By the early 21st century, Japan had one of the oldest populations in the world. Rural towns emptied, schools closed, and a shrinking workforce was asked to support a rapidly growing elderly population. Work culture remained demanding, even as security declined. Long hours were still the norm, particularly for male office workers. For younger generations, following the traditional path no longer promised a stable future. Yet, social pressure to conform remained strong, making alternative paths feel risky or shameful. These pressures showed up not only in attitudes, but in everyday life. Despite its reputation for high-tech efficiency, Japan retained deeply traditional systems. Personal seals, known as hanko, were still required for contracts and official paperwork. Bureaucratic processes moved slowly, sometimes defended with the claim that Japan's complex writing system made digital transformation difficult. Whether excuse or explanation, the result was the same: a society where adaptation lagged behind reality. Social isolation became a visible consequence of this strain. Some individuals, particularly young men, withdrew almost completely from education, work, and social life. By the late 1990s, this phenomenon had a name: hikikomori. These were not rebels or dropouts in the Western sense, but people quietly disappearing inside their own rooms, often supported by aging parents in silence and shame. For others, isolation took a different form. As rents in major cities climbed and job security eroded, a new class of working poor emerged. Some began sleeping in internet cafes, open all night, cheap, and anonymous. These individuals became known as net cafe refugees, employed but effectively homeless, surviving on temporary work and small rented cubicles rather than apartments. Education, once a reliable ladder to success, became another source of anxiety. Entrance exams continued to shape life trajectories early, even as the economic payoff of success weakened. For many, the fear of falling behind became stronger than the hope of moving ahead. During the worst years of stagnation in the late 1990s and early 2000s, mental health struggles became harder to ignore, forcing Japan to confront social costs it had long kept private. All of this unfolded in a country that remained technologically advanced and outwardly functional. Japan continued to lead in robotics, infrastructure, public safety, and efficiency. Trains ran on time, cities stayed clean, but emotional well-being lagged behind material order. Systems built for discipline, predictability, and endurance struggled to adapt to uncertainty and change. In many countries facing labor shortages, immigration became a tool for renewal. Japan chose a different path. Immigration remained limited, with cultural cohesion prioritized over rapid transformation. Stability was protected, even as its long-term costs became clearer with each passing decade. Japan chose caution over disruption, continuity over risk. Today, Japan stands at a crossroads. Its history proves that it can reinvent itself when survival is on the line. But this crisis is different. There is no invading army, no dramatic collapse forcing immediate action. The challenge is slow, internal, and deeply human. The question Japan now faces is no longer about strength or discipline, but flexibility. Can a society built on endurance and conformity learn how to change before it is forced to?